Hello, and welcome to the final of 6 presentations in the Women in Global Leadership series. My name is Christina Arnone, and I serve as a board member of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we are so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. Around the world, women are transforming how business gets done in sectors from government and foreign policy to the arts and international commerce. Women bring unique perspectives, approaches, and value to leadership roles. The International Relations Council is proud to present a 6-week series of insightful conversations with women in positions of global leadership. With their help, we'll explore the opportunities and challenges female leaders face in an international landscape and the outlooks and insights that have made the difference for them and their sector. We hope you'll engage with us today as we hear from women in global leadership in foreign policy. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. We are grateful to our sponsors who have made today's program and the Women in Global Leadership series possible. In particular, Global Series sponsor Dr. Karen Beth Zacharias, Sustaining Series sponsors Stinson LLP, and Supporting Series sponsors Burns & McDonnell, Nicole Gresham Perry, Hallmark, and Hush Blackwell. Thank you for finding value in these conversations. We are also grateful to the Sustaining Conversation sponsors for today's panel, Mitra Amaran. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our panelists and help us navigate the conversation. Dr. Karen Beth Zacharias is the chair of the Division of Humanities and Liberal Arts and director of the Lawrence D. Starr Center for Peace and Justice at the University of St. Mary. Her passion for human rights began when she lived in Turkey as an American Field Service student after high school graduation. Expanding her understanding of international laws around protections of vulnerable populations, Karen Beth teaches courses on the history of genocide, women in world history, and modern Africa. Karen Beth has a JD from the University of Kansas School of Law, and a PhD in history from KU. She is the Vice President of the United Nations Association of Greater Kansas City. Karen Beth, thank you so much for being with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you for all who are joining us today. This is such a privilege, and it is my privilege to introduce to you our wonderful panel for today. Nicole Andahl, who is going to appear shortly. There she is, Nicole, who is the Senior Vice President of People and Culture at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you for having me today. I'm very excited about this.
We are pleased to also be joined by Anne Louise Colgan, who is the Director of Public Education at the United States Institute of Peace.
Thank you, Karen Beth. Really happy to be here.
Exciting. And finally, Sarah Staton, who serves as the Deputy Director for the Office of Science and Technology at the United States State Department.
Welcome. It's an honor to be here.
It's great to have you all here with us today, and we look forward to this conversation on foreign policy. I thought that maybe we are having this discussion against an interesting moment in Glasgow, Scotland. There is a major United Nations climate change conference. And so I wondered, as you talk and think about your own roles and your stories in leadership, how you see women's roles and leadership in this space against this extraordinary global conversation on climate and the planet. Where do you see women leading in this space and in this area? Nicole, maybe we could start with you.
Sure, thank you very much. So, as we all know, women are disproportionately impacted by climate change, not just in, the so-called developing world, but globally as well. I think it's been really interesting to hear some of the conversations that are happening over in Glasgow and, seeing how people are trying to navigate this idea of tokenism of women's voices in these settings. From my perspective, I'm keenly interested to see that they continue to see women represented at the table in decision making when it comes to any type of decision that's made about the future of our climate and how we continue to try to holistically handle this issue. And understanding that, women's voices, Indigenous voices aren't just there to, provide sound bites or photo ops, that they actually have something meaningful and should not just be contributing, but also be part of the decision-making process.
Thank you. Anne Louise?
Thank you, Karen Beth. I would agree strongly with what you said, Nicole. And I think the question really is whether the participation is meaningful and how we measure that, both in the moment and afterwards. I mean, climate change is really the existential global threat that we're facing right now. This is a moment of great global challenge, and this is a real peace and security issue as much as it is an environmental or other issue. And of course, I work at the U.S. Institute of Peace, so we have a peace lens for this conversation. But it is really a challenge for the idea of global cooperation. It's a test for international institutions that have been around for a long time, that are under pressure like never before to really deliver. And not only to deliver in the face of a crisis like this, but to deliver on the promise of meaningful participation, of truly inclusive processes where voices are raised, included, factored in new ways that we haven't seen before, but that are going to be essential for us to make progress on this issue.
Thank you. And Sarah, I know you are probably kind of front and center on some of these things as well.
Well, and so I absolutely agree with the points that Nicole and Anna Louise have brought up. I would just add kind of looking to that next step. So I absolutely agree, having both the inventory taking, the ability to steer decisions, the ability to be at the table and an active participant, all of those things are critical. But one of the pieces kind of my sister office is part of the major response for the State Department with regard to Glasgow is really looking ahead. I think that this is where women's participation has been so critical, is where does the rubber hit the road? How do we continue to work with those with those communities, not just at those communities or waiting for the photo op of those communities, because honestly, the solution isn't going to be made through statements. It's not going to be made at that table. It's going to be made through all of those incremental changes, the shifts that we make, the policy decisions that we have, the sacrifices that have to be made, and how are those borne out across our communities and the communities around the world, that I really think having women at the table is critical. One, because they're disproportionately impacted, but two, the ability to have that long-term game and value the cooperation that will be necessary and key to be able to get us to the solutions that we need to. I think women are the group that are going to help us to get there.
Wonderful. So, well, we'll start with you, Sarah, because you're here. In your own journey, how do you see this fitting in with the story of your own journey toward leadership? Where do you feel like you have a seat at the table? What were some of the challenges to get to that seat? And how do you see yourself contributing into this foreign policy space?
I have a non-traditional pathway, I would say. So my background, I have a PhD in chemistry. I have come to the State Department through the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And honestly, I've been able over the last 7 years to leverage my experience and expertise in science to really ground truth our activities in science diplomacy. Science really is going to be the guiding force for how we're going to engage internationally, right? Science has the ability to be an economic disruptor. It has the ability to, bring people out of poverty. It also has the ability to subjugate people in a way that we've never been able to experience to date. And so science, I think, is that really key element that can either take us forward or bring us back. And so I've been able to come out of a fellowship and become the deputy director for the science and technology cooperation here at the State Department. And I think being both a woman from the sciences and specifically the physical sciences, where female representation perhaps is not as strong, coming into the foreign policy sphere has provided me a unique perspective, but a perspective that's highly valued.
Wonderful. And Louise?
So I'm with Sarah on the non-traditional pathway, and I have been in DC for over 20 years, and really the through line of my career to date has been broadening the conversation about foreign policy. So I work at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I run the public education program, which is, so USIP was created by Congress. We focus on international peace and conflict resolution. And so that mission is focused externally, internationally, but there's another part of our mandate that focuses on educating and engaging the American people. And so that's a program that I have built over the past decade and that I lead at USIP. And so we are working across the country with schools, universities, local organizations, and national networks to connect them into conversations about peace and security around the world, what it looks like, how people can get involved, why they should get involved, what peace building looks like in practice. And so this notion of expanding the conversation is really important to me. I live in DC, and so I'm in DC conversations, but my heart is in the conversations that I have in other places around the country. And, understanding the perspectives that other people have on the US role in the world, on foreign policy priorities, on issues like climate change and how we'll actually be successful in facing global challenges like that. Those are, I think, really important perspectives that aren't brought sufficiently to the table. And so I've been at USIP for a decade. Before that, worked in other organizations, both nonprofit and government funded. But to me, this question about making international issues more accessible and more relevant is more timely than ever. And so I think making those conversations truly inclusive and enabling young women and all women and people with all sorts of intersecting identities to be a part of those conversations, to see themselves as having a stake, is incredibly important as we go forward.
Wonderful. Thank you. Nicole?
I think I had a more traditional pathway. I'm a Cold War kid, graduated from high school in 1990. I grew up on movies like Red Dawn and Rocky IV. And for me, kind of the light bulb was when at my high school, we started getting students from Russia, or at the time, the Soviet Union. And I made a couple of friends and I went, you guys aren't like the way they're portrayed. And it resonated with me because I also saw myself represented, and I'm like, I'm not the way that I'm portrayed either. And so it really, for me, that was the genesis of my career path. I was majored in Russian at Howard University, and then that took me to law school later to focus on international policy and law, did a semester in Ukraine. And so I was very laser focused on the intersection of law and policy and diplomacy, specifically in the former Soviet Union. And that's where I spent the majority of my career. It eventually moved more into like the non-proliferation and WMD interdiction space. And then I took that forward to a career on the aerospace and defense side. I only left government because I met my husband, who's from St. Louis, by the way, and he was Navy, and we had to move around a little bit. But, I found myself, at a point in my career where everywhere I went, I was the only person that looked like me at the table. And it did not really impede my career trajectory, but it was something that was kind of always what I was aware of, and really making sure that my perspective was, and my lived experience as well as my professional experience was always in consideration when decisions were made if I was being asked to contribute to a discussion. And that was true both in government and industry. And so I came to, I'm at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C., which is a think tank right down the street from both Sarah and Louise. And, you know, as a think tank, we generate policy recommendations. We do analysis. We are highly influential in the international and domestic policy community. And so in my role, I'm really here to make sure that we have representation within these policy spaces, because we are in a global environment and policy challenges that necessitate diversity. It's not something that's a nice to have or the right thing to do. It's something that's absolutely crucial to our continued position as a world leader and being able to be, helpful in the global space. So even though I didn't start my career thinking I'd be in charge of, people and culture at a think tank, it is kind of a natural progression of my career, and it is the right place for me to be after a 25-year career on the policy operator side and practicing law.
Did you have an internship? We did have a question in the Q&A. Did you all have internships along the way? Are there internships still readily available? I know internships sometimes, unless they're paid, disproportionately benefit those who can afford to have an internship. But what was an internship part of your work at your study at Howard or afterwards?
So I did do an internship, but not until I was in law school. I actually worked full time while I was in college. So when I was in college, there were not very many paid internships in DC. And in fact, when I did my internship in law school, it was unpaid, and I had to work full time on top of that internship. I'm happy to say that a lot of the think tanks in DC now and several of the US government agencies do have paid internships. We pay our interns here at CSIS. There are other programs that Sarah can speak to that are state and USI, and Louise can speak to at USIP, but the opportunity for compensated work are much broader now than they ever used to be.
Great. Sarah?
So I definitely was not in a position to take an unpaid internship during my career trajectory. And thankfully, I do think in the sciences that there is a better model with regard to compensation. Like it's more the norm than it would be to take an unpaid internship. At state, there are ongoing conversations about how can we move towards a model where more interns are compensated, because I do think that it greatly reduces the aperture of who is capable of taking on living in DC with the expense of this area for an extended period of time. But there are, even right now, certain opportunities through like the Pathways internship program. So if you're in a master's program or in a PhD program, my office, for example, we have a Pathways intern right now. It is paid, and it also provides a non-competitive pathway into the federal service, which can be incredibly valuable in its own right.
Great. And Louise?
I think internships are a really important way station for a lot of people who end up in foreign policy work, especially in DC. Part of the challenge, as my co-panelists have pointed out, is that not every internship is paid. Interns at USIP are paid. They're called research assistant positions, but only available to those who are enrolled in DC area institutions. So that's already a little bit of a smaller category. So part of the challenge is whether they're paid or not paid as internships. And I think another challenge is that they're highly competitive. And so whenever I have had the opportunity to hire an intern anywhere that I have worked, I've been just inundated with resumes, and a lot of them are frankly, what many people would view as being overqualified. They've had just incredible resumes. I mean, some of these just blow my mind. These are people in their early 20s, and my gosh, I mean, just 4-page resumes with all of this experience and Ivy League, pedigree and all of this. And so that cannot be the only way to break into foreign policy employment. And I think that's another challenge. And I think what Sarah's pointed out, the Pathways opportunity and others like that, other ways in which mentorship is available, other informal opportunities for people to get some experience and get some exposure are incredibly important, because by definition, internships in DC are not terribly accessible or inclusive.
What about mentorship? You mentioned that. This is a question that's come up. What do you have mentors? Did you have mentors, men, women? How did you better understand the framework, the landscape for foreign policy?
So I've never had a mentor with a capital M, but I've had lots of people who were really helpful advisors to me throughout my career. And I think it's been an incredible benefit. I know it's been an incredible benefit to me. I am a mentor to lots of people, and again, not a formal mentor, but I mentor lots of people. I believe very strongly in paying it forward. I've had some opportunities throughout my career, and so I will always make time for informational interviews. I will always make time to stay in touch with people who are interested in being in touch with me and knowing how I got to where I am, or who might need to pick my brain about connections or something else. I think that sort of informal networking is greatly undervalued. And I think when people think about networking, they think about walking stiffly around with your business card in your hand. I don't quite know how to navigate it. And it's actually much more organic than that. And it's really about relationships. It's about follow through. It's about building connections with people. And that to me is the trick to being successful, and the trick to being able to really pay it forward and create spaces and opportunities for the next generation and for other colleagues who might not otherwise have those kinds of opportunities.
Thank you. Nicole, what about you in terms of mentoring or mentorship?
I've been in a couple of formal mentorship programs as a mentee. I've not I have maintained one of those relationships over the years, but my two most, I'd say, relevant mentors for my career are both old white guys. And it's not, and so I think my point in bringing that up is that I think sometimes there's a presumption that you have to find a mentor that looks like you and comes from your background experience for them to be a good fit in helping you guide your career. This one mentor I consult regularly, like they're almost like my oracle, and it's someone who I trust and that I can reach out to with regularity that really helps. I also have a 21-year-old mentor, which some people think is kind of odd, but for me, it is one of my most useful mentor relationships, because I, in my place, have presumptions and ideas about things, and there are things that I don't understand about some of my more junior colleagues. So when I think of mentorship, I think of any relationship. You can have a peer mentor, right? I mean, it's anyone to whom you can consult. It can help you navigate this complicated workspace and decision making, and in some cases reassure you that you really have value and are doing a good job too.
Wonderful. Sarah, what about you?
So I absolutely agree with Nicole's point. Mentors don't have to make sense from, like, if you were to like pick them out of a catalog, that isn't necessarily who's going to be the most useful. But on Anna Louise, I find that, as you progress up, being able to make sure that all of the additional knowledge, like being a federal hiring manager, is not the sexiest part of my job, but it is like the best as far as being able to learn how do you navigate that very complicated system, and making sure that it isn't just a boys club, or that everybody understands how do you access that system, how do you navigate that system. And I think making sure that mentorship is holistic, right? It's not just in the foreign policy space, it's also how do you exist in that space and how can you be a full human. The other concept that I'd like to raise is I find finding anti-mentors sometimes as useful as finding good mentors. I love the positive, I really do, but sometimes that's not the example that you're provided. And so I like also finding opportunities to take stock of what parts of myself I want to make sure get preserved as I progress in my career, and who are the examples that I think represent that. I value people who are able to be at top levels and maintain their humanity and kindness. That isn't always valued. And so I have found a few individuals that help to crystallize that, how much I value that as a person during my trajectory.
Wonderful, thank you. So another question that is in the Q&A that will shift us a little bit in terms of gears is a question to do with how has the information age, the TikTok video, Twitter sphere, social media, all of these things, how has that both benefited and maybe caused some disruption in the space for women, for those voices that are less often heard? How do we see that in terms of a foreign policy perspective, and thinking about how has this really been a game changer for people's voices that have not been heard before? And are there any downsides to it? Sarah, what do you think?
I working for an institution that I still think is finding its voice in a lot of social media. I think that it provides a really powerful platform for especially younger voices and more diverse voices to find a channel to be heard. I think that it also, Anna Louise, I think you pointed out that like your job is to communicate to the public what we're doing. I think the State Department doesn't do that particularly well all the time. I know that a lot of people are trying, but that isn't something that if you walked up to the average American and you ask them, what does the State Department do? It would probably be an incredibly small sliver of the important work that is actually conducted by the department. But by having, not just the secretary's remarks being the only mechanism for information to get out, you have, the ability to lift voices about water quality in Botswana, or, using various engineering and innovations around the world. And so I see it as an incredibly powerful tool to democratize what voices are heard.
Anna Louise? I know you talked about how you're really pushing out that conversation on education.
Mm-hmm. I agree very much with what Sarah has said. And, there's a difference between the opportunity that something provides and the reality of how it plays out, right? And so tech and new tech and social media can be an incredibly powerful engine for peace in the work that USIP and State Department and others do around the world, can also be really powerful for engaging new voices and in new and creative ways. But it doesn't always work in that way. It's not always necessarily a positive. And so it really ends up depending on, of course, how it's used, who has access, and so what, right? Just because voices are raised, does it actually matter to them? Does it matter to the larger conversation? The work that my team does is really about engagement and about education. And so it's less about simply having a megaphone and pushing the conversation out, though that's a piece of it, right? Making sure that these conversations are present in other communities, but having it be really a two-way exchange, making sure that perspectives from both sides are shared, making sure that when my team is engaging with audiences around the country, that we're actively listening to those perspectives with respect, embodying what it means to be a nonpartisan institution that is charged with building peace around the world and charged with serving the American people in that work. And so making sure that we're understanding what resonates, what matters to the people with whose taxpayer dollars we do this work. And so I think, new tech, it has potential that has been borne out. There's also some challenges with it. But I think all of these tools that can be harnessed to engage more voices in the conversation, to Nicole's point from earlier, that this is essential to finding a path forward, making sure that these voices are factored in and are heard and are heeded. And so I think this is clearly an important asset at this point as we move forward.
So Nicole, I am to that point, and I think it was you, I apologize for that mentioned this earlier, but just because the voices are heard doesn't mean they really are a part of the conversation, other than for someone to say, yep, we're noting that you've spoken. Oh, they spoke into this space. So is that a danger with media and information and all of this tech? Is that a danger that it's simply a way to say we've had this part of the conversation and then we don't have to have the next part of the conversation, the serious part?
Yes, exactly. And I take both Anne-Louise and Sarah's points, in consideration in saying this. And, definitely, social media, the opportunity is, there, but the execution is not, right? So when the message goes out, it tends to hit those that are like-minded. And so it's not really, in my opinion, it's not necessarily right now the best tool for kind of broadly disseminating information or to diverse communities, right? Like if you look at my social media algorithm gifts, they're all fluffy dogs and old houses, right? So it's one of those things where now there's an opportunity for, kind of the larger, more established institution such as ours to use our platform to make sure those voices get to a different set of ears. And I think that's really where you might see maybe some real opportunity, if we on our social platforms are able to elevate those voices and push them outside of where they normally land. I think that's really where the opportunity lies, but it's just a tool. I mean, like what, Anne-Louise said, it's really about us using every tool we have available to make those connections and facilitate those conversations. And social media is just one of those tools.
So several years ago, I was at the Women's Conference at the United Nations, and one of the very interesting dialogues or dynamics, and this is in kind of in the foreign policy sphere, was local women from all over the world who said larger institutions come in and swallow up their local conversations. And so if you think about how women leadership in foreign policy, how can women think about both those global conversations, and I think you each have spoken to it in different ways, at a local level? How do you encourage women's voices to see themselves as important in big conversations, but at the local level? Nicole?
That point you made about swallowing, and it's absolutely true. And I think there's always this risk of, when you lend your voice to a larger platform, to have it kind of massaged and manipulated before it kind of goes, out the door. I think I'm answering your question. I think my brain went a completely different direction from your question. Fine. So forgive me.
Go any direction. It's a conversation, right?
Is back on fluffy dogs. So, I think, we're seeing more representation. I mean, we are seeing more representation of women's voices in leadership. We really are. Just because an Angela Merkel is leaving her position doesn't mean that someone else isn't going to, step into that role. I think there's also this tendency to see women's voices as monolithic.
Right.
And the more women you bring to the fore, you're kind of on a sub level adding even more enrichment to the conversation. But I think having women in leadership has really helped to preserve the integrity of the voice. And I think it's just a matter of continuing to use that kind of matrix and that network of women building relationships across, our community and our profession, being able to amplify voices across the spectrum, I think is really important. I think all of that, it has to be seen as kind of a more of an integrated approach as opposed to more of a provincial fractionalized approach. I don't know if that answered your question. That's just
Well,
my
yes, it does. I mean, if you think about how do we listen, because you're right, we don't paint a broad brush. All women are not the same. They're 51% of the population of the planet Earth. So, and we tend to go, all women are this. No, they're really not. They each have communities. They each have their own uniqueness. So how do we really think about that and not get them swallowed up into this, well, women want? Have we asked an individual woman? So we'll ask Sarah.
So I think one of the powerful pieces that I've witnessed with having female leaders in my bureau and above is the ability to ask questions and listen to what is the answer. Because there are a lot of well-intentioned individuals, but that doesn't necessarily yield the best outcomes. So having the ability to just listen to what is needed, what is wanted, and how that type of engagement should go forward, I think is such a critical piece. Not to say that that's exclusive to women. Obviously, there are some, men and other community members that really are focused on how do you work with partners as equals instead of trying to have some type of asymmetric relationship. But I do see that the ability to listen and to value that in engagements is something that I define in a hallmark of more women leaders that I've worked with.
And Anne-Louise, you just referred to this a few minutes ago, how your groups really are in part of the idea of engagement, and that is both listening and conversation. How do you balance this kind of foreign policy sphere with those individualized local engagements?
Yeah. So a couple of points I'd love to pick up on. One is not only are women as a population not monolithic, but each woman has her own multitude of identities, and that brings with it a different combination of perspectives. And so it's incredibly important to heed all of that, and as women to feel comfortable bringing whatever or all of them to the table in any given conversation. And that's not always possible, we know. The other thing I would say, Karen Beth, is that these conversations are happening, driven by women at local levels and communities everywhere. And they're not often seen. They're often, in fact, not only not represented, but actively excluded. But throughout history, and certainly today, women have been leaders, and leaders in really, really meaningful ways in their families, in their communities, in their localities, and above when there have been opportunities or they've been able to create opportunities. And so part of it really is shining a light on those examples, but the right kind of light, so such that they don't get swallowed up, to the original question that you had asked, Karen Beth. And so that's a bit of the challenge. But I think it's incredibly important for young people today to see a diversity of role models, and particularly for people who would aspire to be in the foreign policy conversation going forward, whether that's formally in the foreign policy sector or just a part of work on international issues. It's really, really important that they see, different people in different roles being a part of that picture. And that's how we really achieve the more diverse conversations that we're going to need to have going forward, getting back to the point that Nicole made originally. And so, there are global conversations that happen in places like Glasgow, and then there's often a disconnect between what's actually happening in communities that are dealing with the real life challenges of whether it's, environmental fragility or conflict or other, name your issue. But women are leading in big ways and small ways all of the time. And so to find the right ways to empower, to support, to engage, and to make them a part of the broader processes that are really driving change, I think is the challenge and the opportunity.
Wonderful. We did have another question, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit on it, but one of the questions has been, and you just mentioned, is that really having a broad range of people being participating in a space. And one of the questions has to do with people with disabilities who want to go into foreign policy. It seems like maybe a few years ago that wasn't quite as available, both a pathway in the government and maybe pathways in other places. How do we raise voices, not just of women, but of other groups that have often been marginalized, and continue to have their voices resonate and then participate in very active ways in the foreign policy sphere? And Louise?
I think we need to start by recognizing that we're not as inclusive as we think we are, and we're not as progressive as we think we are in a lot of cases, either as individuals or as institutions. I think there's been a really interesting shift in the past year that has forced, because of the national conversation, that has forced institutions that previously thought that they were doing a really good job on particular metrics to really look again and to listen to their people and to think about what's actually happening, whether they are as inclusive as they thought, and then what does it mean if they're not. And I think this is true on a whole host of different issues. And I think that this is a learning process. And I think we're actually probably further behind than a lot of people would have wanted to believe we were. But I think it starts by recognizing that we have a ways to go, and by actively engaging in that process, and by listening, and by being committed to, realizing that you're not where you need to be, and being truly committed to taking the steps that it'll take to get there. And I think that's a work in progress for my institution, and I think it's a work in progress for a lot of institutions in DC and beyond.
Thank you. Sarah, what do you think?
So I think I agree with Anne Louise's points. I think that it's also, you have to go out and find the networks, right? There's an acknowledgement of blind spots. There has to be the active step of seeking out those voices that perhaps haven't had those entry points historically. But there's also personal accountability. As we work with individuals, we need to make sure that, for example, I was able to step in at a certain point to make sure that I helped somebody to navigate how do you get a certain type of airline ticket because they needed certain types of accommodations, and they didn't feel like there was anybody to help kind of navigate the black box that is, trying to travel on the federal government's behalf. And so there's just the ability of raising your hand and saying, I'll help, that I think so many people like that go so far. And then I think I saw the question in the Q&A is, there really is this pathway through the Schedule A hiring process in the federal government that is poorly advertised, it's poorly articulated, like helping to be able to help people to understand what would constitute as a disability for federal hiring, understand that there's non-competitive methods of hiring there, and for that not to have stigma. I was just working with somebody recently who would be Schedule A eligible, right? So would have a non-competitive pathway, they're a contractor, but they were so worried that this was going to negatively impact them down the road, right? Would this be on their SF-50, their permanent record? Would this preclude them from being able to do certain kinds of work? Would it preclude them? Would it hamper their ability to advance? And I think that we have to acknowledge that that fear is real, right? People are afraid of the stigma, and we have to systematically do things within our community and in the way that we build our work culture that helps to support people so that they can feel frank and open, because honestly, it's only when people can acknowledge that they need certain things that the system will be able to provide that, even if the safety net is there currently.
You, Nicole?
So we have employee resource groups here at CSIS. We just launched this year. We just launched our disabilities employee resource group. And I'm going to segue to another question just very quickly. So we have a university here in Washington, DC, Gallaudet University. it is very difficult for those students to find work in the foreign policy space in Washington, D.C. This conversation over including disabilities as part of any diversity, equity, and inclusion program is something that you have to remind people of constantly, because immediately, whenever you talk about, this is a very ability focused profession. And so, you know, really kind of framing it more into a, you know, really being very intentional and specific about the type of capability somebody has, and whether and how whatever physical condition they have not being at all relevant to the job we want them to do. So I think that's a discussion that's continuing to evolve in this space, but it's really important to make sure that that is absolutely at the top of the conversation. You know, I think when you ask the question, it's also like other areas of identity, right? You don't know who's in your community until you ask the question. So I think that, you know, starting to ask the question and letting people feel more empowered to actually provide their answer, right? I think that's how you start elevating the voice, but also making sure that we continue to enrich our community and make sure everyone is, you know, has the opportunity to participate and advance in their career. And then, like what both Anne-Louise and Sarah were saying, that allyship is so important here, right? So that the allyship that you build within your workspace, the allyship you build within your department, to make sure that folks are, that they are adequately represented and that they're respected in the workplace for who they are. I think that's also very, very important.
Thank you. So speaking of the culture of foreign policy, what challenges have you had in that space as a woman, and what has helped you navigate that? Nicole, we'll start with you.
You know, it's really interesting as a Black woman particularly, and as a woman generally, you know, always having to remind my superiors or my colleagues that they should not make a presumption about how I will either behave or perform based on my identity. And also in the international policy space, in the diplomacy space, not presume that our foreign colleagues or partners are going to see me through the same lens that they might as American men. Okay, so I'm going to give a specific example because I think those work better. So when I was at the Department of Energy at NNSA, and we were doing non-proliferation training over in the Caucasus region of the former Soviet Union, I was put in as a team lead for the group that was going to Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And my boss and I had a conversation where he was very concerned that I would not be taken seriously by our foreign partners in the region. And another colleague of me, this is where allyship matters, again, an old white guy, said to my boss, if you give her respect, they will treat her with respect. So it's kind of like that two kind of prong piece. One, you're making a presumption about how they're going to see me based on your own lens. Secondly, having an ally there to make sure that that didn't happen.
Wonderful. And Louise?
It's such a big question, and there's such a lot to unpack. We could take a second hour on just this. And it's, you know, it's a little hard for me sometimes to know how to answer these questions, because how much of it is about being a woman, how much of it is about, you know, the sort of personality that I have, or this, you know, particular institutions in which I've worked. I mean, I will say that I have learned a lot from being in this space for the last 20 years. And when I look back at who I was 20 years ago, I am more confident in my value and in my place, and less likely to feel like I don't belong in meetings, for sure, than I did earlier in my career. And I know a lot of younger women, particularly here, but in other places, people sort of, getting back to my original point about informally mentoring, they worry because they don't always have the sharpest elbows. So they're not always the quickest to speak up in a meeting. And that was me. And there are certain people put certain assumptions on that. And so I have certainly found that I've had to, work hard to prove myself. And I've sometimes had some challenges from bosses and from colleagues. In general, there's an organization called Women in Foreign Policy, and they describe the foreign policy field as male, pale, and stale. And I think that that's a little harsh, but I have certainly been in settings where it has felt that way. And so, drawing on your inner gumption, which is a word that I use a lot, to know your worth when you walk in the room, and not letting people make you feel a particular way, owning that only you can control how you feel. I think those are things that I have learned better over time. And they're things that I think can be hard for younger professionals to internalize and to practice. And so I'm aware of that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Sarah?
So I would pick up on Nicole's piece about allyship. I think there's like always that extra work, right? To try to like make sure that the table is even. So where I'm incredibly happy that there were allies ready to go for you, Nicole, I also think that women need to be willing to craft allies, to educate in the moment. So this was a month ago, right? Not that long ago. I was meeting with a foreign delegation. I won't say from where. And I was head of Dell for science on our side, and all the rest of my delegation was male and white. And the foreign counterpart, we did the introductions. There was a variety of briefing materials. It should have been incredibly apparent that I was his major interlocutor. He refused to make eye contact with me for the first half hour. But because I was able to work with my team ahead of time, they all went in lockstep with me, right? They didn't undercut me. They didn't try to circumvent me. They were incredibly supportive and respectful, in part because I had taken that extra step ahead of time, a little bit because I did suspect that this might be a consideration. But I think it's making people aware that this may be the dynamic, and making sure that you can have that supporting team, even if that isn't something that is organic going to happen. Now, after a half an hour, we recalibrated appropriately. But sometimes it takes that little bit of extra work, because no matter how your side might be able to view you, foreign policy really is about the intersection, and people come to the table with different expectations and different ideas about who they expect their interlocutor to be. And sometimes it's a mutual education opportunity.
Do you think that if you think back over the past 20, 25 years, we have had, starting with Madeleine Albright, women as Secretary of State. We have had women leading in this country, Condoleezza Rice, Madeleine Albright, Hillary Clinton, in that foreign policy space. And so that it hasn't just been white male or just males, but that we have had women who have been those leaders. And so at the big tables, there have been women present representing the United States in a way that for a long time that absolutely was unthinkable. Do you think that has helped too in the foreign policy space more recently?
If I could jump in here.
Please.
So there's a really important GAO report talking about where do you find individuals with certain backgrounds and demographics throughout the State Department. And while I am definitely incredibly happy that we're seeing more people at the top. I'd say that that's not really where the question is today. I'd say it's about seconds, thirds, fourths. What does the representation look like behind the scenes? Because those are the voices that are going to be filtering into those briefing papers and are going to be the ones who make those decisions about, do we take this path? Do we not take this path? Do we engage with this community? Do we not engage with this community? And that GAO report I found incredibly eye-opening, because it talks, from my perspective as an individual, not as a State Department representative, it articulates with data where that glass ceiling is. And so while you might be able to tout overall statistics is roughly like 50-50, maybe slightly less female, it breaks it out by like where they are in the GS scale. Are they predominantly in contractor positions versus permanent positions? Do they find themselves in politically appointed positions, or are they part of temporary staff? And so I think it's not just about looking at the data as a whole and patting yourself on the back. I think it really we have to have the thoughtfulness to come in and realize, what does the group that is informing the executive secretariat for the secretary look like? And does that group really represent the United States in its entirety?
That is fascinating.
Yes, Sarah, I want to totally second. I'm going to second you on that. I think there's a lot of, I think, those highly visible positions do send a message outwardly. But when you're talking about, when you're looking at particularly someone's career trajectory, you see lots of diversity at the entry level, and you see a little bit more at the senior level, and then you just see people just fizzle out at the mid-level. And, we're finally asking real questions about why. It's that GAO report that you cite, Sarah, is fantastic, because it actually gives you some quantitative data to put in front of someone to say, this is why we need to really work on retention and inclusion and equity for all employees at every stage of their career, not just when they walk in the door, not just when they are at the senior level. And then the other thing that really touches on is what I call the unicorn theory, which is about the availability of qualified talent at the mid level. There seems to persist this fantasy that women and people of color do not exist at that level. And what they're failing to realize is that women and people of color tend to move around a lot more at that mid-level in their career. And so what that does is it really impacts their ability to move up. So I'm very encouraged by that report, and I'm very encouraged that people are paying attention to it, because they really, really need to pay attention to that if we're going to have a meaningful discussion about women in leadership and foreign policy.
Thank you so much. And Sarah has put in the chat the GAO report for those who are interested. That's very helpful. And we are winding down to the last couple of minutes. So are there any last words? And Louise, do you have any last thoughts? We maybe can go quickly each person so that we can end on time.
Yep, just wanted to come in on that last question real quick. I know we're short on time. First, I think we have come a long way, and I think it's really important to recognize that. And I think figures like Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, they matter not only as role models, they matter because that perspective being represented in our senior foreign policy official actually really matters. And it's not sufficient, and we need to do more. But I think when we look back over the course of the last 25, 30 years, I think we have made some progress. In key roles on key agendas like women, peace and security, which was a key resolution at the UN 21 years ago yesterday, which has made it official that women should be more active participants in peace building. And I think that's a really important step forward. The other thing I would say, to pick up on Sarah's point about the importance of not just looking at the top, but the second, third, and fourth positions, not all women leaders are allies to other women, and understanding that dynamic is something that we could spend a long time discussing as well. But again, it gets back to the original point about not making assumptions. And so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm getting the red flag. I really want to thank all of you. This has been a great conversation, and it has been my pleasure to visit with you all. And I see Christine is here, so I'll turn it over to Christine.
Thank you. Thank you again for joining us for this Women in Global Leadership series. We express our thanks to our moderator and panelists for this meaningful conversation. We also thank Global Series sponsor, Dr. Karen Beth Zacharias, sustaining series sponsor Stinson LLP, and supporting series sponsors Burns & McDonnell, Nicole Gresham Perry, Hallmark, and Hush Blackwell. Thanks as well to our sustaining conversation sponsors for today's panel, Mitra Amaran. Do visit our website at irckc.org to learn more about other IRC programs and how to join us as a member. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, guys.